So getting into chapter 5 today, we spent a lot of time in chapter 4 talking about how to actually make the user interface and how to actually interact with the user. So chapter 5 goes a little bit deeper into how do we make that user interface more friendly, right? How do we make it look better? Okay, so there's a lot of tools in this kind of chapter that will deal with how does the UI look primarily. So with 5.1, we'll be talking a bit about different kinds of drawables that you can use. We've really only tackled one, which is to basically just use images, but there are a bunch of other ways that you can create drawable resources, which kind of work like an image, but there's a lot of different variations, a lot of different things that you can do with quote-unquote those drawables. So we'll deal with that. We'll deal with, there's probably, I think, 5 different drawables that we're going to go through today. And then we'll also look at styles and themes kind of on a brief note. And then tomorrow and Wednesday, primarily what we're going to be getting into is something called material design and some of the tools that we have available to work with that. So drawables. So we start out at the base, we start out with the Drawable class. Any kind of thing that we want to show that kind of behaves like an image is a subclass of drawable. Okay, so anything you can draw to the screen like an image is going to be a drawable. Okay, which typically means drawables have kind of a minimum width and height that they can be set at, but they can also usually be grown and shrinked, grown up and shrink to smaller. But there's a lot of different ways to do that. All of these resources will be stored under the Drawable folder, the resource Drawable folder. Some of these will be XML files and some of these will be image files. Okay, the large majority of what we're talking about today is actually XML files. But there is some more stuff to touch with PNGs and such. So different kinds of drawables that we can use. We can use a basic bitmap file, and that's anything that is a PNG, JPEG, GIF, any file that we like that directly stick into the drawable file, drawable folder. That's how it's going to be rendered as a bitmap drawable. Okay, which just means it takes the data and shows it. And again, you're more than likely when you're working with bitmap drawables, you're going to need a different version for each of those different screen densities, right? So remember when we create an icon, it does create an XML file, which is that vector version, but it also creates the bitmap version at different densities, right? So typically if you just get an image from a user, whether it be a photo or something, it's going to fall into that category. Does that make sense? Now, there's another kind of image that we can deal with, 9-patch, which we'll talk about, and that's kind of PNG files, but they can be stretched, right? So they can be normal PNG files, you can kind of stretch them up and down, and they work okay, but they don't work really well for things like the background of a button, because everything's stretched at the same rate. So with the 9-patch image, it stretches different parts of the image different amounts, which works really well for like button backgrounds or other kinds of backgrounds. Then we'll also look at layer list, which will kind of let us stack drawables on top of each other. They can actually be any kind of drawable, but we can make a stack of those. We'll look at shape drawables, which are kind of like the vector drawables. Gives us a really simple way to define a shape that we want to use as a background in XML, such as rectangles and circles, or adding in gradients or things like that, are very easy with a state drawable. We'll also look at stateless drawable, which kind of allows you to have a different kind of stack of images, similar to the level list, but only shows one image at a time. And the most common way that comes up is things like buttons, right? So you may have a regular state when you're not interacting with it, and then say a pressed state, or also maybe a disabled state, right? So you're going to have different images that are used in different sort of scenarios. Does that make sense? That's where the stateless drawable comes up. It displays a different image depending on the state of the control. And then we look at level list. Level list kind of gives us a scale from like 0 to whatever we want it. Think about if I wanted to do a 5-star rating, I might say, here's the image if it's at 0, here's the image at 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 5 star. So it allows us to put together a list of images and kind of scale from one to the other. You can think of a battery icon, which is one of the assignments that they're going to give you, is how many bars, or same for Wi-Fi signal, how many bars of signal. So that can come up in a lot of places as far as a transition drawable gives us 2 different images, and it allows us to crossfade between those 2. So it can be all the way over on one image or all the way over on another. I'm not too clear on where that one comes up as much, but it is one of the options out there. You might see that maybe for, say, in a progress bar. Maybe you have it, all the way full, and then an image that's halfway full. That might be one way you do it. That one's not going to use as much. And then vector drawable, which is kind of the more general version of the shape drawable. And those vector drawables we usually get from SVG files. So, and then even going on from there, you can create your own drawable subclasses if you would so need, but usually this fills all of the needs. So bitmaps, right? So bitmaps can be JPEG, PNG, GIF. You are allowed to put BMP files in there. Don't do that because, again, they're kind of uncompressed. They'll take up way too much space when you go to deploy your app. So you definitely want to start with some sort of compressed image, not an uncompressed image, I would say. For devices that are running 4.0 or later, you can use the WebP format, which is one that's put out by Google. It's a newer kind of image compression format. It's supposed to be better in terms of compression, but I'm not too clear on how all that works. It's similar to a PNG, I know as much. But again, that's only supported on Android devices 4.0 or higher, which is most devices on the market. But generally speaking, these are all going to come in as a bitmap drawable. Okay, that's what you need to know. These are you've got drawable up at the top. This is a subclass. You get but only these kind of things are bitmap drawables, right? So all the other ones that we get into, you may see some example code, etc., casting things as bitmap drawable. It's only going to work as long as you have this kind of image. That makes sense? If I want to refer to a drawable file just as a refresher, typically I'm going to see that in the XML as @drawable / say my image. That's the name of the image. If I'm using a picture from another package, say I want to use a standard Android image, you're going to see an @Android : before that. Does that make sense? So if you see an @Android : before that, you're using a standard image. So let's say I want to use a standard home icon or something of that sort. I can't do that way without having to actually import that image. If I want to refer it in code, similar to how we've accessed all of our other resources, you can do r.drawable.find. And then depending on kind of what version of Android you are running, you may be able to call just get drawable directly. You may need to call get resources and then call get drawable on that object. Make sense? Similar to how you saw things worked with get color, that get color method may or may not be there depending on what version of Android you're running. So another kind of drawable that we can work with, again, this is kind of behaves like an image because everything that's drawable behaves like an image, is a 9 patch file. Now, a 9 patch file has an extension of .9.png. So we start with a PNG file and we kind of do a conversion to make it into this .9 file. Okay. Now the goal with this is that we're going to stretch different parts of the image in different ways. So if I think about how a normal button background works, right? Normally I'm going to have sort of a border around the sides. I'll have kind of corners, I'll have edges, and I'll have the inside, right? Now, typically, if I just use that image directly behind a button, well, remember, not all buttons are the same size, right? So if I scale that image, then I may get a lot of distortion. I'm also going to see that the borders get bigger. The bigger the button is, the bigger the background is, right? So let's kind of look at how this is going to work in Android Studio. I'm going to start with kind of the finished product to show you where we're going. So I've started with this image here, which is just a simple rounded rectangle, right? And I want it to stretch in such a way that these corners don't change size, and these horizontal edges only scroll horizontally. The vertical edges only scroll vertically, and then this inside is going to scroll and is going to scale in both directions. So I'm kind of splitting this up. Okay, the end result is then I get it stretched. If I stretch it vertically, it looks kind of like this. If I stretch it horizontally, stretch it in both directions. So that looks all fine, right? All the edges are still crisp. You don't really know what the, you don't even notice that it's being stretched. Does that make sense? So that's kind of our ideal. Okay, so I'm going to walk back and see how did we get here. So let me actually go ahead and delete the resource files that I've already created. And why am I not getting a... Yes. Oh, because I'm using the wrong keyboard. That's why. Yep. Okay, let me delete all of those for now. So looking at the screen that I have, I've got just a basic login screen, right? So the important thing is I just have a button there, okay? So what I want to do is put a nice background on there. So if you look under, I do kind of want you to work along with this. If you go to Unit 5, the Unit 5 labs, you'll see that there's an attachment. Actually go over to Student View under Unit 5 there. So button back zip. You'll want to pull that down. It's got a few different image files in there, which is what we're going to work with. Just prepare those ahead of time so that we don't have to do too much in class with how to actually make that in an image editor. Once you pull that down, you'll have a few different files. The one I want you to grab is buttonback.png. Okay, because that's the one I'm going to start with. So buttonback PNG, actually we can bring in all three of the PNG files. So there's a buttonback PNG, there's a button text, buttonback text, and a buttonback icon. So I'm going to grab all three of those and bring them into Android Studio. Yep.
Login screen.
Yeah, login screen is what I have open. So I'm going to bring those into the Drawable folder. No, I don't want those. Okay. I just want those directly into Drawable. It was telling me to put them in XHDPI, but I actually just want them in Drawable. Actually, rather than doing it that way, I'm going to right click on here, say show in Explorer, and then I'll just copy and paste them into the actual Drawable folder. There we go. So I add those 3 images in there.
You just drag them to the Drawable.
I just copied them into. You could drag them in. That's fine too. I didn't want to move them. I wanted to copy them. Okay. So when you get those 3 images into your project, just raise your hand so I know when everybody's done. Again, I have included the .9 files in there, right in the zip, but you just want to bring in the .pngs. I wanted you to see kind of what the finished product was, but I want to start from the
What file type is that by default?
So this is just a PNG.
So like, well, if you were to use that, hold on, I'm just confused. Does it become a? Like
we're
a
gonna turn it into. What do you mean?
Like,
so right now this is just a bitmap.
Okay.
Right now all I have is a bitmap.
And you're gonna turn it into a 9 patch.
We're gonna turn it into a 9 patch in a minute.
Okay.
I gotta go through how to.
So by default, everything you bring into the drawable is a little bit that for the most part.
If it starts with that if it has that .9.png extension, then it will go ahead and figure out that it's a 9 patch.
Okay.
But if it's just .png, it will be just a little bit. So you have those in there. You've got those in there. So looking at the project.
Wait, so we're supposed to put in just the PNGs?
Just those 3 PNGs, not the .9 files, not the SVG.
Alright. Yeah.
It looks like it's doing something. Testing. Okay. So we've got these 3 images in here. So I want to look at what it's going to do if we don't make these into 9 patch images. Okay, so that's our first step, is let's look at what happens if we don't make these into 9 patch. So I'm going to go to my layout. If you don't have a button, go ahead and add one. But I'm going to use this button that I have already here. And I'm going to give it a background of that first image, button back. Okay. So you can see as I added it, it already kind of made the button bigger. And let me actually make it even bigger so that we can kind of accentuate some of the issues. So rather than, the height to wrap content, let's say maybe 200 dp, or maybe even bigger than that, maybe 400 dp. So a nice big button. Okay, I'm going to run this on the 7-inch tablet. So what we can see is you see all the blurring that's happening around the corners, especially. It's stretching the entire image to be that size, right? And it's stretching it all the same, right? So that's part of why we're getting blurring. It also means that these corners are getting bigger, right? So whereas they might have been teeny tiny little corners, they're getting to be bigger corners. And the more not square this is, the more some of those artifacts come out. So let me say, go down to 100. That again. Right. So you kind of see now it's stretched a lot horizontally, but it's not stretched much vertically. Does that make sense? So that happens a lot with these kind of images, and it's kind of a common thing to want to put a background on your buttons, right? So that's where we are right now. Okay, let's try that real quick before we move on with the other two images. So you can see that's what it is with just a straight, there's nothing happening on the button. What happens if I also throw an icon in there? I'm going to go ahead and take the text off.
So what's causing it to look like that?
So remember, we haven't 9-patched these yet. So the reason that it's doing that, remember, it's stretching it. Every pixel in the image is getting stretched by the same amount, right? So here we've got, I've set this to 100 dp, so it's kind of stretching it less. It's kind of shrinking it horizontally, but stretching it vertically, right? So you can see that star is really kind of messed up. It's not real clear, right? Same thing if I do the text, button back text. You can see how these come out, and they're very blurry images. You can tell that the aspect ratio is not what it was originally. So there's just a lot of issues with it, right? Okay, you see that? So that's what we're trying to fix. Okay, we're trying to make these images scale in kind of a smooth way. Okay, so let's go back to the regular button back, because that's the first one I'm going to look at. So let's go open up button back. You can see this is what the image looks like right now, right? So notice there's no fancy UI, right? The only thing I can do here really right now is zoom in and zoom out of the image. I can just look at it, okay? So in a second, you're going to see a bunch of extra controls as we convert it to a 9-patch image. So right-click on the image here over in your resources. In the menu, you're going to see this option that says Create 9-patch file. Okay, so again, this is on just the regular button back. Click Create 9-patch file. Okay. It's going to ask us what to call it. We're just going to give it the default. As you can see, the only thing that's changed is it's added in that .9. Okay. Now, one interesting now if I open that, we'll see, hey, the whole editor's changed. Now, one interesting thing that it does here, you'll see that it's actually kept the original file. If you leave it as such, you're actually going to get an error when you try to run the program, because there's two resources with the same name. Okay, so we need to actually delete the old button back file before we go too much further. So I'm going to delete button back.png so I only have the 9 patch version. So out of the box, that's not really done much. The only thing that it's really done is kind of change the name of the file. And one other thing it's done is actually added an extra 2 pixels to the size of the image. Because what we're going to do is the way we set up a 9 patch is by drawing on the edges of the image. Okay, so we draw on the edges of the image to define how the image can be scaled. Okay, because what we're trying to establish is, again, those corners, they can't be stretched. We don't want them to be stretched. And the edges, we want them only stretched in one dimension. Does that make sense? Now, let's be clear, this only works for some types of image. So if I say throw a gradient on here, the gradient's not going to look real well because it's going to be stretched differently depending on what part of the image it is in. So you usually want to start with something that's a solid background or close to solid in the center of the image. Okay, so the way I draw those sides, you can see if I kind of hover over the image, you see it's starting to change shape. Now, it actually does matter if I'm on the left side or the right side, okay, or top side or bottom side, okay, because it's going to do something different. Okay, so what I'm going to start by doing is I'm actually going to draw on the, kind of on the left side. So I'm going to grab this bar on the left side. I'm going to bring it down here underneath the corner, and I'm going to bring this one up above the corner, right? So now you can see there's a little black line over on the left. Okay. So what that does, it defines what areas can be stretched. So anything without that black line is stuff that is kind of fixed. It won't stretch it. But the things with that black line, that area will be stretched vertically. Does that make sense? So if we look at how it factors out here, you can kind of see now that when we're stretching vertically, maybe those corners are a little bit more clear, right? Because rather than stretching everything evenly, I'm not stretching the corners at all, but I am stretching the center part. Okay. Now I also want to do the same thing with the other dimension, because you can see this is fine, but this horizontally stretched area, it's still got very blurry corners. So we're going to do the same thing there. Go up to the top, bring it in, bring it in. So just by doing that, it stretches a whole lot better. And you can see even the one that's stretched in both directions is pretty clean when I look at the edges. Okay, there's no blurry artifacts happening. The other thing I can do, there's a bunch of checkboxes down here which will let you see different kind of pieces. So one thing I can do is click Show Bad Patches. You can see how it's kind of showing me these red rectangles. Well, anytime you see that, that's saying, hey, this area maybe isn't stretching the way you want it. Maybe there's some artifacts. So what that means in this case is that I've included a little bit of the corners when I specified which areas you can stretch. So if I bring this up a little bit, because you can kind of see I've hit the bottom part of that corner, and you bring it up here, and there they're gone. So you can, generally it's good to check that box and kind of look at where are there maybe some areas that might have some problems with scaling, because sometimes they're not immediately obvious just from a quick glance. Okay. So the other thing we can do, we can click, say, Show Patches. And one of the things you'll see here, you see that there's the green and the blue kind of on the inside, and other parts that are not shaded. So with the Show Patches check, you can see that this area is not going to be scaled, right, because there's no coloration on it. These are going to be scaled in one direction, and then the center area is going to be scaled in both directions. So that's what that's for, is to kind of highlight what areas are set. I'm going to uncheck that in a minute. You can also click Show Content, and that shows something not here, but over on the right side. Okay, and what you'll see, because I haven't done anything with the content area yet, notice that that blue rectangle occupies the entire image. Okay. Now, typically, when I'm putting, let's say, text on top of an image like this, I probably don't want that text to overlap the border. Right? That makes sense? I don't want the text to overlap the border. So if I leave this as is, what I told it is that the content area is the entire image. So you can put text or images or icons on top of this anywhere you want, right? So I want to say, well, you can only put content in kind of a certain area. Namely, I want to exclude the borders so that you're not overlapping the borders. Okay, so the way I do that, remember we did the left and the top side? Now to specify the content area, I'm going to do the right and bottom sides. Okay, so on the right side, let's bring this down. Bring that up. So what you can see kind of in the preview, you see how that blue rectangle has moved, right? So we're saying only this part is valid for the content. Right, so I've given it some kind of vertical space on the top and bottom that it can't use for text. And I can do the same thing if I go to the bottom image and stretch it. So you can see the text now has to fit into that box. It's kind of like adding padding inside of the 9-patch image, if you can think about it that way. So does that make sense? So you want to do both of those two pieces. Yeah.
So if we have that, if we're doing that with the one that has the icon, the icon will stretch like until it reaches kind of that point on the edges where.
So we have two different ways to do the one with the icon, which is why I want to look at that one. So let's come back to that in a minute, folks. The way that we deal with the icon and the text is going to be a little bit different. But you can understand what's happening here. So these lines on the edges is what does all the magic of determining which places can be stretched. Okay. Does that make a lot of sense? This is, again, something we do a lot of times. And typically, especially when we deal with this with the button, we may have more than one 9-patch image, because recognize this is only one state, right? I'm probably going to need a regular inactive state as well as a pressed state. So I may actually have two of these in a typical button. Okay. Before we talk about the icon, I do want to quickly preview and look at what this is going to look like right now. So button back, well, something's not right because it's not showing me anything. Let me reopen that. Because this was working. Oh, I might need to go back to still nothing. Project. There's my text, but my icon is not showing up. My image is not showing up. So what did I? Oh, it hadn't built yet. Okay. As soon as I hit run, it shows the image. Oh, and I put the text in the wrong side. There we go. So there you can see. So regardless of what size the image is, there's our first image. So that's our objective. Okay. So let's look at the icon next. Because sometimes you're going to find out that I have an image like that I need to use as a background and not just a regular, hey, here's the borders, right? So how we deal with that is maybe a little bit more difficult. Okay. So similar to how I started with the regular just background, I need to right click on this and say create 9-patch file. Okay, and then I'm going to delete the old one. Okay. So now I just have the icon with the .9. Okay. Now, I have kind of two ways I can deal with this particular background. One way I can deal with it is perhaps maybe I want to scale the icon. Maybe I want that part in the center to grow as big as the button is. Okay, that's one possibility. And the other possibility is that I may want to keep the image, that icon in the center, the same size and just scale the border. Right? I may want to keep the icon the same size and just scale the border, or I may want to keep, or I may want the icon inside to change. Okay. So let's say I go through this and I'm going to follow the same way I did the previous one. So I'm going to define on the left how it's going to scale. I'm going to define on the right how it's going to scale. Now, interesting thing here, see if I put these lines maybe in a non-optimal way, right? So I'm kind of saying part of this area scales, part of the icon scales, part of that star scales, and part of it doesn't. You can see all the weird patches that come out on this side, right? So we have to be very careful with where we put those when we have some image kind of in the inside. So I need to make sure when I'm putting these patches like this, not only do I have the issue of needing to make sure the corners are not stretched, I need to make sure that this icon, at least if I'm doing it this way, entirely fits into the blue area, right? Which actually does kind of create some issues because, at least the way that this image was created, we do have some overlap with where the corners are. Okay. So if I start with that, okay, I don't have as many artifacts, but we can see if I scale the image up vertically, you can see it is stretched here. It is stretched horizontally, and then here it's stretched in both directions, right? So these especially, if I'm going to set it up this way, I'm going to have some problem if it's not square, right? It's not going to look all that good if it's not square. Okay. So honestly, if I have something like this, it's usually better to stack two images on top of each other rather than just simply using a 9-patch by itself. Does that make sense? So if I wanted to have this kind of stretch with it, I might say make the other image the background, and then on top of that add the stretch. Break it out as two layers. Okay? So that's kind of an issue, right? If I want to have it stretched to the full size of the icon, this is maybe not the best solution. Okay? Now, what if instead, I want it to keep the icon the same size. Any theories as to how we might do that? How can I keep the icon the same size? So remember, we've got these patches, right? So what's not changing? It's corners, right? So is there any way I can get the image to not be covered by any of the boxes? There's actually more than one way to do this. My goal is I don't want to have the image covered by any of those boxes. What I would suggest first is maybe can you get it so that it's at least not covered either by the horizontal or the vertical boxes. The vertical is probably the easiest on the side. Close. So what do those black dots on the top and left mean? What do they mean? What am I saying when I mark these black?
They can be recycled.
They can be recycled, or more specifically, they can be stretched. Right? So I'm telling you those areas can be stretched. Okay? So one of the things I can do, if you think about that in context, let's say I move these. Let's see if I can grab that, move that over a little bit. And instead of having that whole big area as the area I'm stretching, do a tiny little sliver over to the right. So if I just have a tiny little sliver over to the right, well, that means, you see, that's the only part it can stretch. So at least if I stretch it horizontally, see, it's going to be fine when it's going to be over on the left side. See that? So if I do it this way, it's always on the left. That's the button. But it doesn't stretch real well vertically, right? Doesn't stretch real well vertically. Well, I can do that same trick in the vertical direction. So let's say I bring this down here and that down here. And now it's going to stretch at least okay in both directions. As you see, what I'm stretching is just these little slivers, okay, keeping everything else the same. Now, because effectively I've moved the star into the upper left corner, right? You can see it's always in the upper left corner, right? So if I want it in the upper left corner, I can do that.
If I wanted it in the bottom left corner, I just move these over here, right? So that at least lets me put it in any of the four corners, right? Now, sometimes I will want to have that maybe centered in one of the directions. Okay? So the way I do that, if I say I want to have it centered in one of the two directions, is I have to use a little thing that I haven't showed you yet. So you can do a drag like this. The other way that you can draw is if you zoom in really, really close and hold shift and nope, not shift. I need to zoom here. There we go. So if I zoom in really close, I can actually draw on the left side by just putting my mouse down and drawing in this empty space. So I'm going to draw a little line right here. See that? And now I actually have two areas that can stretch. So this area can stretch, and that area can stretch, which means that this star ends up in the middle on the left side. And if I were to do the same thing and say do that two regions going vertically, I could say, well, now it's always in the center of the button, but not stretched. Does that make sense? So you can't actually define more than one area, because sometimes you need to define not just one stretchable area, but two.
And then what you have is effectively a grid of 9 cells.
Yeah, usually it's a grid of 9 cells, right? So that's why it's called 9 patch, because it's usually a grid of 9 cells where you have the 4 corners, the 4 edges, and the center, right? It's usually 3 by 3. In this case, it's not really, this one is not 3 by 3. Have you rotated? This is just defining what parts can stretch. Oh. You just drag. So just as a test, I'm going to run that real quick here. Let's say put this into icon. Right, and so I can see the star is just on the left side of the button. Right, so that's kind of a common case for when you're putting buttons up, when you're putting an additional icon in there. That's usually where you're going to want to end up. So does that answer your earlier question of how to do that? So you can do that. You just have to be a little bit more tricky with how you set up the 9 patch. And let's look at that on the text side, right? So again, same thing with the text. I need to start by converting it to a 9 patch. And then deleting the original. Okay. So looking at the text, let's say we do kind of start with the same approach. Bring it in, bring it in. So this arrangement that we're looking at right here is typically what we refer to as kind of 9-patch, because that's where there's actually 9 regions. But again, you can see the same problem happens with if I have text in the middle, that it gets scratched depending on how I'm scaling things. So I typically don't want to maybe scale that text, right? So I can take the same approach that I did with the icon and only select the parts, some parts to scale. So I might say, well, let's on the left side, let's pick the area beneath the text. Let's pick an area above the text. And similarly here, we may want to pick an area to the left of the text and to the right of the text. And it's unfortunately not fully centered, at least the way I've set this up. You kind of see how the text looks like it's a little bit to the right.
So we could just step back. Step back, look until we undo. Yeah. No.
Now, the way you delete it is by making it 0 pixels wide.
Oh, yeah, you want.
So one important rule to know here, the minimum width that you can have in these sections with the height of these sections is 2 pixels. So the part that's stretching always needs to be exactly 2 or 4 more. You can't have just a 1.
Which here's all it is.
If I change So typically if you want to get something like this perfectly centered, the kind of trick is to make sure this is the same size as that. So if this is 3 pixels, that also needs to be 3 pixels, because otherwise they scale differently. So that puts the text roughly here in the center, making sure those two are the same. I hope what you can see with this is kind of to play around with it, you kind of need to do it hands-on a little bit to see where things fit. Now, worth of noting, so these 9 patches that we're creating here aren't strictly an Android thing. This is how Android deals with 9 patches, but there's a lot of different, most other kind of technologies also have a way to do this. So for instance, there are websites and tools out there that you can get to use to make 9-patch images like this for websites, because the same trick works in pretty much any software tool that you want to use. You just have to write the code differently. Now, the nice thing is with Android, once we've defined it this way, Android automatically deals with all the scaling. So there's actually no code that I have to write to make it scale this way. All I have to do is create the resource. Does that make sense? So that's it as far as 9-patch image goes. Okay. Any questions still with setting up those the text, the icon ones? Yep.
So what are those savings? Like savings PNG?
It's actually as a PNG. It just has a slightly different extension, but it's literally just an image. Okay.
So is it just one part of the patches stored in the actual file? So if I moved it to a different Android Studio project, it would still keep them?
Yeah, it's just these black lines that these pixels that we've changed here. That's actual image view.
Okay.
That's all it's saving. So if I looked at the actual image, I could just open up this 9-patch in regular image viewer, and I would see these black lines on the outside edge. That's all it does. It's actually stored with the image data. Okay. We're at 1:30, so we haven't gotten really far, but let's go ahead and take a quick break. Come back at 1:45. So just one final note on the 9-patch images. One thing to keep in mind is these 9-patch images, the way they work, they can be scaled up, but they're never scaled down. Okay, they are scaled up, but they're never scaled down. So what that means is, with the original image that I have there, the image always has to be at least that big. It can't be any smaller. Okay, so typically when you start with that original image, you want to make sure that it's as small as can be. Okay, and that typically may mean going back into the graphics editing program and maybe shrinking it down. So for instance, usually if I get artifacts like this, they're usually coming from a graphic designer. I may have to ask for that original Photoshop file or something like that to make it actually smaller, so I can accommodate smaller buttons. Because for instance, if I look at this image right here, this looks okay, but you can see that my button is very big, right? My button is very big. And it's okay as long as my font size is decently big, because I've set my text size to 30 SP here. But if I say go down to 10 SP, the text of the image, the text is going to go down, but the actual size of the button doesn't change because it's sort of fixed at that minimum size of the image. Okay. This is set to wrap content for the height, so it's going to take either this. It's going to take the larger of what's the minimum size of the font or what's the minimum size of the image. Does that make sense? So it's just to keep in mind. You may end up needing to go back into the original image file and shrink it down and kind of redo that before you do this 9-patch process. Does that make sense? There may be additional stuff that you can cut out. Okay. So that's 9-patch images. I'm going to go back to my slides. The next kind of drawable that we can create is something called a layer list. And a layer list is just, hey, I want to stack all these images on top of each other. If you've used any sort of graphics editing suite, you're probably familiar with the idea of layers, whether you use GIMP or Photoshop, the idea that you can put layers on top of each other. So this is created as an XML file, and in that XML file you just say this image is on top of that image is on top of that image. So you give a kind of a list. Each of these is items, and they're arranged, if I remember right, from bottom to top. So here's an example
resource here. We've got layer list, tag up at the top, layer list, and tag at the bottom. We can see that we've got 3 items here. Okay? So the first item is a red Android logo, then we've got a green Android logo, and a blue Android logo, right? So the first item is appearing behind all of the others, right? So it's from the back to the front. And you can see that they put some left, and essentially kind of put some padding, some positioning in there so that they don't appear directly on each other. So does that make sense? So this gives us ways, for instance, if I wanted to put an icon on a button, this is actually kind of the better way to do it, because I can take that background and then put an icon file on top of it. You have a hand up?
Yeah, so was the Android top and left attributes always in reference to the first item in the list?
It's in reference to the top left corner of the drawable.
Okay.
Of wherever the drawable is. It doesn't refer to any specific item in there.
Okay.
So if I hadn't set top or left here on this third one, the blue would be exactly on top of the red.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Which is typically what we do. We don't actually usually specify a top and left, but you can. But again, the most common way to use this would be to say, hey, I want to slap an icon on top of my button background. The other place that we sometimes see these 9 patches, which is not just buttons. The other common place that you'll see these is edit text. Oftentimes it's worth putting a background or changing the background on your edit text so they have a kind of a different order. And the other thing that comes in there, that's most common where you see those kind of icons in the background, is you might have an icon like that when you use it with an edit text. Okay. Another kind of drawable I can use is something called a shape. Again, a shape is defined in XML. So I can start with a few different options. I can start with a rectangle, I can start with an oval, I can start with a ring, I can start with line. So I start with some basics here. Then I give it additional kind of attributes, different tags inside. So I can specify what do the corners look like? Does it have some sort of gradient? Does it say have some padding? What is the solid color of it? What do I fill it with? And what is the stroke or the color of the line? So if I look here, here's kind of an example shape drawable. So we start with a shape tag. Again, this is an XML file. So I'm going to say Android shape. This is going to be a rectangle. And then I'm saying, okay, I've got a gradient. And we'll see, so over on the left, on the right it's blue, over on the left it's white, and it kind of fades in between white. So I'm saying that it starts at white, ends at blue, and then I've got this angle 45, which changes which direction the gradient goes. Do I want it to go left, right, right, left, up, down, up, etc., or at some sort of crossfade. So I can do all that. And then finally I've got corners, which are radius 8. So that's what gives it the rounded corners. Otherwise it would just be square corners. So very quickly, this can set up things like that, which we had to set up in the 9-patch image. Does that make sense? So we can, if we need a more flexibility, if we do need to start with a raster image, we can use that 9-patch route. More often than not, a lot of those simple cases can be just handled with a shape. Does that make sense? Usually we can just handle that with a shape, and that is a little bit less work, a little bit more configurable. Okay. Should we say want to apply that resource as a background, and we could do that in code. So I grab the resource object, grab the drawable. Again, the shape is just another drawable. Usually in code I don't need to know specifically what kind of drawable it is, so I'm just going to say drawable. Okay, usually I don't need to cast it to any specific kind of file. And then I'm going to say set background. So I don't really need to know whether it's a shape drawable, or layer list drawable, or bitmap drawable. I can just give it as a background. So transition drawables, again, these are the ones where we can kind of fade between two images. So I start defining these in XML using a selector tag, and then I have items inside there, kind of like the layer list is set up. And then in code, I need to call start transition, reverse transition to actually start the animation, because these actually involve animation. So typically a transition image will start at the first image, and then we can transition it over to the second. So here I've got the transition, I've got a selector. Here I've said, okay, so the first image is on, the second image is off. So it's going between these on and off images. Now, by default, it should start over here on, because that's the first image we gave it. If I want to then in code change which ones it's showing, I'm going to say start transition, and that's going to start it transitioning to off. Now, the number I put in here is how long that transition is. So this is 500 milliseconds. It's going to take a half second to go from on to off. Does that make sense? So that's for those kind of animations.
Is it just like a fade?
It is a fade. Yeah, it's just a simple fade between the two images. Okay. I could also use something called a vector drawable. Vector drawable is kind of like a shape drawable, but we're not limited to those few initial starting shapes. So typically the way we're going to get here is we're going to start with an SVG file, and then we would convert it to a vector resource. So this is supported at API 21 or higher. Okay, one of the reasons why we're starting at 21 for this semester rather than, say, 14 is that allows us to do things like this. So when I bring that in, let's say I want to bring in a heart, I would start with, say, the heart as an SVG file, and then I could import this, and it's going to come in as path data. So all of the kind of instructions to draw it, as I kind of mentioned previously, so here in this path data, it says the fill color is red. Does that kind of make sense? The way we get in here, let's say I go to Drawable, say new vector asset, kind of like I went new image asset. I could pick a clip art, and then this is just going to create the XML for it, not the raw raster file. So that would be one way. Or I could say over here, local file, and we start with, let's see, I think it's on my desktop that I have those. Desktop. So there, I could pull those in, actually just do the regular button back. So I created that file originally in a program called Inkscape. You might create it in Illustrator as well, either one. But if I brought that in, you can see it's kind of taken the data that was in the SVG file and converted it and put it into this path data portion. And then if I want to change colors, like I couldn't necessarily easily do that with the PNG files, but here I can change colors. I could say, okay, well, let's make this magenta. So FF00. Or, oh, nope, I need FF at the end. There. So I can easily go in and change colors. So that's the upside of having it as a vector drawable instead of a PNG file to start with. Does that make sense? I can easily then do things like that, change colors, as well as it scales smoothly to any sort of screen size. Now, this one's still going to have the same issue if I leave it here as this vector asset, if I try to put it as a background, because it's still going to make these corners bigger. So let's say I go back here and that,
you can kind of see it's still having some of the issues that I had to resolve with the 9-patch, right? So that's the case where you may still want a 9-patch over a vector drawable. Okay, now you can do this fine with a shape, because the shape will automatically take care of that scaling if you start with a rectangle. But with the vector drawable, you still have some of those issues. And delete that. Okay. So that's a few different types. So we've used Image Asset Studio a little bit already, and just to refresh on that. So the Asset Studio is kind of a tool for importing existing resources, especially maybe starting with the existing clip art icons. So we typically use those for a launch. You can use those for your launcher. You can use those for action bar icons. Most places that you need an icon in your application. Remember, when we go in here, we're going to go into, say, import an asset, create a new image asset. We're going to pick the name, choose what we actually want as the image, and it's going to give us that great name. Okay, so the Vector Asset Studio, as we saw a minute ago, is basically the same thing, only supported at API 21 or higher. And the difference being here, it's only creating that one XML file instead of creating the XML file plus the images usually. Does that make sense? They look very similar, but you're going to get a different UI depending on if you say add an image asset or if you say add a vector asset. Another useful thing to know about, we won't really do too much with it here right now, but there are some additional libraries like Glide and Picasso. Picasso is actually really good for loading images that are not typically part of your app. Okay, so Picasso is really good for, say, I need to download these images from my website. We can grab those images, have Picasso kind of take care of loading them, and then putting them there when they're loaded. So if you need to grab images that are provided by your user, or whether it be on their device, or whether it be images that are out on the web somewhere, typically we're going to use Picasso for that. So we'll manage caching, meaning keeping track of images that users recently viewed, rather than having to download them every time we see them, as well as kind of dealing with loading them and popping them in as it can. Does that make sense? So I won't go too much into Picasso because we're not really doing anything with it right now, although we may come back to that at some later point. So now that we've talked about drawables, just to rehash, what kind of drawables did we go over? Real briefly. So we have our shapes. Okay. So we've got shapes. Huh?
The gradient.
Gradient, which was a shape.
Oh.
Okay, so we got vectors. What other types of drawables did we look at?
9-patch.
9-patch. Other types that you can use. Got shape, vector, 9-patch. Layer list. And one more.
The transition.
So transition. Oh, I guess one more after that. Forgot about transition. What else?
Gradient.
The shape.
Bitmap.
Bitmap, right? So that's the one we talked about previously. That's anytime you just bring in a regular PNG file, you get a bitmap, right? So we know about bitmap, right? This is just our simple raster images. What are maybe some of the downsides of using a raster image?
Difficult to scale up.
Okay, so scaling can be a problem, especially given different screen densities and such. What's a potential upside? Where might you see these bitmaps?
If they're for smaller images, they might be easier to load.
Okay. Are there any kinds of images, is there any particular kind of image that can't be one of these other ones? Can't be represented as one of the other types? Think about photographs, right? Let's say you've got a nice pretty landscape picture, right? Can that, of the mountains or whatever, can that be represented as one of those other kinds of images? No. So photographs you can't really represent as vectors, right? So typically if you're going to see photographs are always going to be of that type. And typically any images that you get from your user, and user supplied images, all of those will be bitmap type. That make sense? The users are typically not going to give you any one of these other types. So these other types are things that we bundle with our app, but anything that's provided from the user standpoint is typically just going to be a bitmap drawing. Does that make sense? Typically everything that's provided by the user is bitmap. Okay, so shape. What's one of the upsides? Why might I use a shape instead of a bitmap?
Maybe because most of them are pre-built into Android. You can easily use and manipulate.
I think you more control over it.
Okay. I would say the way I would word that is configurability, right? They're very configurable in the sense that it's very easy to change the color, right? Or the length of the width of a line, or things like that, right? So they're very easily configured. If I start with an image that came from, say, Photoshop, the only way for me to go change that image is I have to go back to Photoshop and change the image, right? Versus with a shape, I can typically configure it just by changing the XML. Does that make sense? It's also very, what else? What are some of the other benefits? You talk about small images. You talk about scaling. How easy is it to scale a shape? Is it an easy thing? Is it a hard thing? Huh?
It's not hard.
It's not hard. It's pretty easy, right? So they're really easy in terms of they're really scalable, right? They don't require a lot of resources. They're really scalable. You can configure them easily, right? So for just our simplest images, rectangles and circles, ovals that we want to stick as backdrops and backgrounds behind, say, buttons or end text, these are very, very good places. Okay, so what about vectors? Tell me something about vectors.
Scalable.
Okay, so they're definitely scalable. They generally have some of the similar sort of upsides as a shape, but how is a vector different than a shape?
It can be more complex than a shape.
Right. So I can represent any 2D shape. right? Versus I only get those standard built-in shapes, right, with the shape. So you can see that's more complex shapes because I've got that path data, so I can represent anything as long as I can represent it with points. It doesn't just have to be a specific built-in shape. 9-patch. What were the advantages of a 9-patch over a standard?
That it can scale in a unique way that others won't be able to.
Okay.
So you could keep certain parts of it from scaling with the rest of the image.
Okay.
I was gonna say this fix the corners.
So you're kind of on the right track. Yeah. So maybe in a more general sense, how would you say that?
You have more control on how it's represented on different screen sizes.
Okay.
Or displayed on different.
Because when you get into a 9-patch image, remember what that changes. That changes how it scales. Okay, remember that changes how it scales. So with a regular bitmap, how is the image scaled?
Sorry.
With a regular bitmap, how is it scaled?
It's all gets bigger.
Right. All gets bigger, all gets smaller. Everything in the image gets applied the same scaling ratio. Right? So you had a hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say that a transformation is applied to every pixel in the image.
Right. So scaling, we apply the same scaling factor every pixel. But with a 9-patch, what are we doing differently?
Controlling which pixels are on the
Right. We're saying these pixels, right, which usually is the corners, don't scale. We say the sides typically only scale in one direction, and then we're saying the middle scales in 2 directions, right? So we're changing it so that certain parts of the image get a different scaling ratio or a different aspect ratio than other parts. Okay. So that's the 9-patch. What about layer list? What's a layer list do? Yep.
That allows you to have multiple views on top of each other.
Multiple, you're close. Multiple what? Not views. Multiple what?
Items.
Items which are drawables, right? It allows you to have multiple drawables on top of each other, right? So this gives us kind of what we might say a stack of drawables. Jeremy, you had a hand up. Jeremy. So that lets us kind of put things on top of each other, right? Now, the thing we keep in mind with the layer list is everything's always shown, right? So with the state drawable, things are only like the press button is only pressed image is only shown sometimes, or the disabled image is only shown sometime. Similarly with the level list, it's only going to show one image at a time. The layer list is always showing all of the images. Does that make sense? And then what was the transition? What was the transition drop? Fade in and out between what?
Multiple drawables.
So 2 images, right? Basically 2 drawables.
Does it have to be 2?
It's only 2 for the transition drawable as far as I know. As far as I know for the transition drawable, it's either one or the other.
I was thinking, couldn't you like make like a makeshift carousel using transition.
A makeshift what?
Carousel, like
Kind of. What you would actually do instead, you would use the level list. If you need more than one image, you would actually use a level list instead of a transition. If that makes sense. So transition is just for 2 images. A level list is where you're going to actually have more than one. Now, so I don't think that either the, as far as I know, neither the level list or the state list are on these slides. They will both be in your labs, so they'll walk through it. They're also in some of the conceptual material, but they're not actually on these slides. So going on to styles. So the general idea with a style, and these are all going to be stored in styles.xml. The general idea with a style is you're taking common sort of styling, common properties that you're using in a few different places in your app and putting them all in one place. Okay. So what this allows us to do is, let's say we want all of our buttons to have a certain background, right? Well, it gives us a way to only change that in one place rather than having to go to every button in our app and change it. Or let's say we want to have all of our text boxes to have a certain amount of padding. Again, we can do that all in one place. Same thing if we want to have standard text sizes, right? So the styles allow us to kind of group together a few properties that we apply to a bunch of controls and then apply them later. Okay. So they do really help. They do really help with maintaining if you've got updates that you need to apply across the board, and they do a really good job of reducing the amount of code that you have to write. So we did this with the recycler view briefly. We did take one. Remember, we took our text view and we kind of extracted the style. It wasn't a required thing actually to make the recycler view work, but it was kind of giving you an intro to this. So here I've got a text view, and we can see that I've got 5 properties applied to it, right? So here I've got the width and height, match parent, and we've got height over wrap content. But I've got the text color, the typeface, and the text, right? So it may be that I want to apply some of these stylings more generally, right? So looking at what's here, as a general rule, I don't want to extract the widths and the heights to my style, because those are things that tend to be very much tied to the layout of a specific page. So it typically does not make sense to extract width. If you do the extract, the alt enter, it will automatically say, oh, you want to extract everything. But we typically don't want to extract everything. So the width and height we're going to leave. What about the text? Is it likely that I'm going to reuse the same text on, say, other controls? Probably not, right? So that's also not something I would necessarily want to extract because I'm probably not going to reuse. But what I am going to extract is, say, the text color and the typeface, because those are 2 things I say, well, maybe everywhere that I'm displaying code, I want to be able to change the font to that color and typeface. Right? So then anytime I want to say, well, this text view shows some code, I give it style code font instead of applying the color and typeface changes. Does that make sense? So I'm grouping those 2 settings into this code font style. Right. So if I extract this and only pick those 2 properties, I'm going to get this. So you can see, just like I've done with all the other resources, all the resources start with at, and then the type of resource it is, right? So it's a style resource. So these are all going to go into the styles.xml file and the values. Okay. So we've named this particular style code font. Okay. So if we were to look at styles.xml, once we've extracted that, this is what we would see. We would see apply text color, typeface. So anything I apply that style to will get text color and typeface. Now, one important thing to note, you cannot apply more than one style to a particular control.
That makes sense? You cannot apply more than one style. So you do have to be a little bit careful with how you set up these styles. Does that make sense? You really only get to choose one. Now, one way I can kind of deal with that is I might create more than one sort of child style. I can actually have these in hierarchies. So let's say we start with code font is the initial one. This is my base parent style. Okay, so code font just says the text color and the typeface. And if we think about, so that's going to be green text. And then I can add another style. I'm going to call it red code. And it also makes it red. So if I apply just red code, it's going to be red and monospaced. Because it inherits everything from its parent, the code font, and then applies our additional styles to it. Now it looks like I'm missing a double quote. So does that make sense? You can make subclasses, right? And effectively of your styles and then apply additional things to it. The other way I can make a subclass here I think that was, oh, it was a lowercase f. Oh, well, why is it an uppercase f there? Not the other way. So the other way I can define a child is I can say code font dot red. So this actually implicitly defines the parent of this is code font. Code font dot red. So everything that's in code font will be running, which means we get that monospace still, and then I get the text color. Difference here, if I want to use this style, I'm going to use this style as, say, red code, or I'm going to use this style as code font dot red, right? So it does have a different name in both of these cases, but oftentimes that's what you'll see. If you put a dot in there, immediately you're implicitly kind of declaring a parent. Does that make sense? So you can either explicitly define the parent by telling it the parent here with another property, or you can use that syntax to do it with dots. The other thing I can do with these styles is I can make something called a theme. So a theme is applied to an entire activity or even an entire application. So if I apply this theme to a application, then every activity is going to get that theme by default. If I want to say specifically this activity gets a theme, then I'm going to apply that to that specific activity tag. So we may have already seen some of that. Let me go back to the project. So in this case, you can see that I'm applying app theme to the entire application, but if I want to say apply a different theme to a particular activity, say the login screen, I might say app for Android theme. And then this could be something else. Say, for instance, no action bar. So I can set the theme on a per application basis, or I can set it on a per activity basis. Now, a theme is very similar to a style. Okay, a theme is still defined in the styles XML file. Okay, the difference being is just what I put inside of that. Okay, so a style is always parameterized. I always have a style or
there at the beginning there, style tag. And also do the same thing with the theme. So here's an app theme that we've got here. When I defined this app theme, I said that the parent is theme.app.dark action bar. So I'm starting with a built-in theme and changing a few things. Make sense? Just like I can start with style, I start with the parent style, and then with modifications on top of that. I can do the same thing with a theme. A theme, as a general rule, will always have a parent. You always want to start with kind of a starting point because there are a lot of properties in it you need to set. So here we're saying we're going to change the color primary, dark, color accent. Right, so that's changing the default colors in Android. That makes sense? Now I can use this to do something very interesting. So let me go back to my project. All right, so I've got my login button, right? So let's say I want to style all of my buttons the same way. No, I need to change what the background is. Let's change it back to button back. Okay. So I'm going to extract some of the resources from here. So I'm going to do Alt Enter. Or I think it was refactor maybe. Refactor, extract. There we go. Refactor, extract style. By default, again, it's got all of these picked. So I'm going to unselect several of these items here. All I want is for all of my buttons to have the same background and text style. And I actually might want to change the color of that to white. So let me go ahead and change the text color to white in here. Because I want to extract that property too. So again, right click, refactor, extract style. So I'm going to take out, we're just going to take out the background, the text color, and the text size. Okay. So extract that. Oh, I need to tell it. So I'm going to call this button style. Hit extract. You can see it's taken out the background and those three settings that I extracted, so they're no longer here. And if I look at styles.xml, you can see those three settings. So I've got the background, the text color, and the text size. Now, one important thing to remember, once I've extracted those styles, remember it's only going to extract from the one place where I told it to extract. Okay, so if I want to have that apply everywhere, I still need to go back to all those buttons and change them to use that style. With that in mind, so let me go back to activity main. We'll see this has changed the button style. I can still change the background to be something else. So let's say I click on here and we're going to change the background to button back. So I can still do that. And if I look at the XML here, you can see I've got the style, but I've also got the background set, right? So if you've got that property set, this actually overrides the style. Does that make sense? So if you're going and converting these to say, hey, I want to set the background of all my buttons to use the style, you also need to remember to remove the background setting that's already there. Does that make sense? So you not only need to add the style attribute, but you need to remember to remove all the existing properties there. Okay? Because otherwise, if I just leave this as is, it doesn't matter what background is set in the style. Right? Okay, so let me remove this here. Go back to the main. Now, it may be It may be that I've got a lot of buttons in my application and say I don't want to go change each of those individually, right? So I may not want to go button by button and apply that button style, okay? So I've removed that style on here. You can see it's gone back to being a regular button. None of my properties are applied. What I can do is I can use a theme to apply that style to all my buttons. Okay, so here's my button style resource. You see that, right? I can actually apply that style to all my buttons. So I'm going to say item, name, button style. So that's the name of this property. I'm actually going to give it my style button style. Okay, so by putting that in here, go back to here, simply by changing the theme that way, I now have that applied across the board. Does that make sense? So I can actually use my theme to apply styles to all of my controls. I could do a similar thing with, say, my text views. So item, name, let's say text view style. Say I want to give all of them a background too. Am I missing something? Oh, no, because I have to do that a different way. I want to change, say, the font size. Item. There we go. So not giving me what I want. Let's hit font style. So make another style here. Item, say font. Text size, there we go. So the text size, let's say we want to make everything 20 SP, and we want to make it font family. Let's make it bold. Oh, I need to spell item correctly. So item. So I should, if I've got all my ducks in a row, style, oh, it says it has to be above 26. I wonder how I did this. Oh, there we go. Edit text style. Well, that's one of those. There we go. So now you can see that I've changed using that style say, the font size of all my input fields, as well as making them, say, monospaced or something like that. So if I want to change all of their fonts to be something different by default, I should have 30 so it's a little bit more obvious, right? So that's kind of one thing I can use, and that actually eliminates a lot of work to, say, scale things actually to tablets and such. Does that make sense? Because I can apply styles to every kind of, all my edit text, all my buttons have these styles. And that's using that. Questions? So things are really, really, really good about reducing the amount of code that we have to write and making things a lot more maintainable because then we're changing.
Is there documentation that has all the name things attributes we have to change?
There are. It's not maybe the easiest to read. Yeah.
Somehow the app bar got the background of the button, right?
So the app bar got the background of the button.
Yeah, that's like the text.
Because you change the text. I have this one that no text style. Yeah. So there is some amount of documentation out there. It's not really the easiest thing to read. So I'd actually just recommend playing around with your IntelliSense. Because basically what you get is a long list of names. The documentation that's out there. It's just a bunch of names of the properties, and it doesn't actually tell you what they do. Helpful. Yeah, it just tells you what the name of the property is, and then you have to kind of figure out what it does. But usually what that means is we've got styles here, which are kind of groupings of properties, and then we've got themes, which are kind of groupings of styles. Okay. So that's all we really needed to talk about today for 5.1 is how to work with some additional drawables and how to work with those themes and styles. And there's a lot more to themes specifically than what we've gone over here. So they're well worth your time to kind of invest and look into and find out what all of that does. The biggest thing to pay attention to when you're working with themes is what is that parent theme. Right? So for instance, we're inheriting from dark action bar. Well, that inherently is going to mean that the action bar is a dark color and the text is probably white. Right? But if I use the light action bar, then I'm going to have black text. Or no action bar saying I don't want to have an action bar start. So that's the biggest thing that's making the the base. Okay, so I'll let you get rolling with the labs.